Mark is an anthropologist by training, but he started out as a journalist. His books include Stranger on the Line, The Secret History of Phone Tapping. He's also written Inside Uganda's West Nile, Violence, History, and Representation on an African Frontier. It is fair to say a significant part of Mark's career as an academic has centered on researching and writing about Uganda. He has lived and breathed all things Ugandan for many years. It comes as a little surprise then that his talk today is about Idi Amin, perhaps the most inscrutable figure in Ugandan modern history. The title of Mark's talk is Idi Amin and the Idea of Africa. His talk draws on his very recent sterling book called Idi Amin, The Story of Africa's Icon of Evil, the one I'm holding up here, published by Yale University Press. Mark, the next 40 minutes are all yours, and then we'll take some questions after that. And to the audience, we would greatly appreciate it if you could all keep your cameras turned off, except Mark. All right, Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Miles. My title here, Idi Amin and the Idea of Africa, I came up with that because it was the original title that I pitched to Yale University Press back in 2008. And I really just want to talk a bit generally about the book, but I also want to resurrect some of the original themes which maybe got played down a bit in the final version. The roots of the book come from my doctoral fieldwork in West Nile district in Uganda, which was Amin's home area. I became fascinated by the history of that whole region. It's the only part of Uganda that's to the west of the River Nile. It's very much associated in the Ugandan mind with not really fully being part of the country, with being a kind of foreign area. And it had a reputation for violence and marginality long before Idi Amin came along. In fact, really since they began to experience slave raids coming down from North Africa in the first half of the 19th century. I don't really want to go too much into the whole history of the region and the detail, but I need to sort of briefly talk about a few things that are very relevant to Idi Amin. Unlike most parts of Uganda, West Nile is not dominated by one specific ethnic group or tribe, as they say in Uganda. It's multiple smaller groups, most of whom also span across borders. West Nile is on the borders, Uganda's borders with Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo now. It's always been seen as a kind of border area in lots of different ways. Before it was incorporated into what was Britain's Uganda Protectorate, it had been part of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium rule in Sudan, so it was part of Sudan. And then for a while it became part of King Leopold's Congo Empire, Belgian Congo. And then it became part of Uganda. So in terms of the kind of normal categories of African studies, it was part of North Africa, then part of West Africa, and ended up part of East Africa. That's pretty marginal in a way, or central possibly in another way. Amin came from one of the smaller West Nile tribes, the Kakwa people, who spilled over both borders, or rather the borders were drawn through them. And there are Kakwa speakers in Sudan, Congo, and Uganda till today. I talked about the slave raids in the first half, around the middle of the 19th century. Through a complicated historical twist. The problem is that some of you are going to know more about this than I do, and others probably won't. So I just want to sort of give a very simplistic overview. What grew up in and around South Sudan were a whole series of conflicting slave armies which were involved in a complex trade involving ivory and guns and people. Some slaves became incredibly wealthy and powerful and don't fit our kind of normal idea of slaves. Various kind of Europeans decided to stamp out slavery in the region, and thereby, coincidentally, they get control over the ivory trade. And one group of soldiers who'd been working with these European forces, who were themselves former slave soldiers, found themselves trapped in an area which was known as the Lado Enclave. Their leader was a German called Emin Pasha, and his forces were trapped in the Lado Enclave. He was rescued by Henry Stanley in a famous episode that became part of the inspiration for Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And his soldiers, these former slave soldiers, were left behind in the Lado Enclave, which covered this whole border area. The southern bit of it covered the West Nile area. So these soldiers were picked up by Frederick Lugard and used as the basis of the forces with which he created what are now the different countries of East Africa. And he regarded these people as the best material for soldiery in Africa. Is the phrase that was used. Gradually, these people became the core of an ethnic identity which became a kind of elective identity which people could take on. People became Nubi. That was the name, Nubi or Nubians, which has various meanings in different parts of Africa. But Nubi became a kind of elective ethnic identity, which you could become if you came from specific groups, and they included the Kakwa, and converted to Islam and joined the army, or the various colonial forces, also sometimes the police and prisons and that kind of thing. So it became something that West Nilers could become, and that was kind of Idi Amin's background. I'll come back to that, and in relation to his own life in a bit. Really, since I wrote my thesis, the question about Idi Amin that has obsessed me, I mean, apart from these broader questions about West Nile history, the question about Amin specifically that I've really gnawed away at from lots of different angles is this one. Why is Amin regarded as the quintessential African dictator? Why is he the most evil dictator? There's a whole load of books, TV series, with titles like The 50 Most Evil Men and Women in History, The World's Most Evil People, The World's Most Evil Dictators. There's even one that's just called Monsters, although it's about people. And in most of these collections, Amin is either the only African or one of very few Africans. He becomes the kind of African incarnation of the dictator, and specifically the evil dictator. That's the word that's constantly used. So that is really the question that I've kind of been struggling with, and that's animated a lot of things that I've written over the last 10 years or so. Working on Idi Amin is quite strange as an academic, because everybody knows what you're working on, and usually we work on things that nobody knows anything about at all. But if I say I'm writing about Idi Amin, then everybody from my students to my hairdresser knew roughly, at any rate, what I was talking about. Amin is a sort of significant symbolic figure in that kind of role. And in that kind of role as the most evil African dictator, there are so many stories that kind of circulate about him. Attributions of cannibalism, sadistic pleasure in extreme tortures, keeping bodies in fridges, stitching bodies together the wrong way round. One account even forcing people to eat themselves. But these kind of wild stories aside, most historians of Uganda and most Ugandans would agree that Amin's predecessor and successor, Milton Obote, killed more people than Amin did. And in his second rule, after Amin was overthrown, Obote killed more people than Amin in about half the time. But no one writes about Milton Obote as an icon of evil. So what is it about Amin that makes him such a mythical figure of evil? I've argued in various articles and in this book that this has something to do with Amin being seen as essentially African, as the most African. And there is a stereotype, a Western stereotype going on here about primitiveness and violence and Africanness, which all become articulated in the figure of Idi Amin. And in previous books, previous articles, I've looked at things like ideas of there being warrior races and the way that the British colonial army picked people from specific warrior races. Things like the legacy of the 19th century slavery. I've looked at things around Amin's performance of masculinity and his kind of hyper masculine behavior and image, and also I've looked at the concept of evil and how a sort of idea of evil as being associated with things to do with violence, to do with sex, to do with eating sometimes. This all kind of comes together in the notion of cannibalism and its association with Amin. Now, it's very easy to see this as just, quite straightforwardly an example of straight Western racism, the idea of Africanness as being the reverse, the complete other of the European. Achebe's famous introduction to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where he writes about the desire, one might indeed say the need in Western psychology, to set Africa as a foil to Europe, as a place of negations at once remote and vaguely familiar, in comparison with which Europe's own state of spiritual grace will be manifest. But to complicate this picture a bit, it has to be said that many or most of the most extreme stories about Amin and many expressions of associations of him and his ethnic background with primitiveness and violence come from southern Ugandans, not from Europeans at all. In fact, many southern Ugandans have a prejudice against almost all northern groups as being more primitive, more violent than the southern Ugandans are. And there's an ethnic component to this of Bantu-speaking people against speakers of Nilotic and Sudanic languages. Probably the most influential book on Amin, and the one that introduced this idea that he was a cannibal, is the book by Henry Kiemba, who had been Milton Obote's private secretary, then became Amin's, and then Amin's health minister. And he defected to the anti-Amin forces in 1977, which was quite late in the process. Most politicians and intellectuals had left Uganda quite a long while before then. So he defected rather late in the day, and may well have needed to establish his credentials with the rebels. Anyway, he was probably the first to accuse Amin of cannibalism, and he explicitly associated this with Amin's ethnic identity. He writes, like many other warrior societies, the Kakwa, Amin's tribe, are known to have practiced blood rituals on their enemies. These involve cutting a piece of flesh from the body and tasting the victim's blood. I have reason to believe that Amin's practices do not stop at tasting blood. On several occasions, he has boasted to me and others that he has eaten human flesh. I totally believe that he boasted to people that he ate human flesh. It fits entirely his sense of humor and his way of scaring and bullying people. But the other thing I want to introduce at this point is some kind of more sort of concrete evidence around this issue of Africanness and primitiveness and its application to Idi Amin, because very easily this can become a sort of theoretical argument within sort of post-colonial theory. In fact, it's can be very, very rooted in archival history. Let me quote a bit from a 1976 Internal Foreign Office report, Foreign and Colonial Office at the time, written by their long-standing head of the Africa desk in the FCO. His name was Martin Ewens, and he wrote this memo called "Dealing with Amin." He writes, President Amin has just celebrated the 6th anniversary of his overthrow of President Obote. It is amazing that he has lasted so long, given the bitter hostility he has aroused in Kenya and Tanzania, the presence in these countries of substantial exile groups, and the numbers of Ugandans who must have personal scores to settle. But his good luck is matched by personal courage and the incompetence of his adversaries, and one increasingly wonders whether he may survive a long while yet. Some thoughts on how to cope with him may not be out of place. One must first ask oneself, what manner of man is he? Theories, even books abound. It is perhaps easier first to say what he is not. He is not a joke. We have partly to thank the British popular press for the impression most people seem to have that he's merely a figure of fun. Cut a big chunk here. He's not mad. Pache's Harold Wilson, I believe it to be a dangerous oversimplification to dismiss Amin as a nutcase. Amin has, of course, a curious background. His mother was some sort of army camp follower, a witch doctor, and there is the business of his visions. But in all my dealings with him, I can say that I've always found a logic and often a craftiness or even an astuteness behind his actions. Blah, blah, blah. He's not sick. He's not mentally or physically ill. To turn to the positive side, writes Ewens, I would say that the two most important clues to his character are that A, he is what I would call an unregenerate African, and B, he is a former British soldier. And then he divides his section, the African. He says, we and the other ex-colonial powers in Africa have been used to dealing with men made in our own image. They were on close terms with our colonial services. Often they were educated and even lived for lengthy periods in the colonizing country. Their thought processes, their ideals, their political frameworks, their whole terms of reference are to a great extent ours. Nyerere, for example, runs a one-party state and practices detention without trial. He justifies them hotly and with some reason, but he has a conscience about them. Amin has no such background, and his behavior and thought processes are therefore very African. The figure Amin cuts is very much the figure which the African in the bush expects of the boss. The pronouncements on world affairs, the messages to his equals, the travels and visits, the medals and regalia. It also means that Amin has no respect at all for human life. This is his Africanness. There can be no question about his responsibility for and personal participation in the bloodletting in Uganda. All this, however, he says, is qualified by Amin's training as a British other rank. As the British Army says, if you see something, whitewash it. If it moves, salute it. To some extent, Amin rules Uganda like an army barracks. First, the whitewash. Kampala, for example, is, or was when I last saw it, a well-run city. The hedges are cut, the verges trimmed, the road signs painted. Amin himself dresses immaculately. Not only good order, however, but also military discipline. Ministers obey instructions, the commanding officer gives and receives briefings, affairs are run from a command post. The concept of hierarchy prevails over that of persuasion or consultation. How then do we deal with him? The answer, I believe, is that we cannot. We are in the predicament of the public schoolboy confronted by the street corner thug. The latter wins because he doesn't know the Queensberry rules and fights dirty. Amin is hampered by no scruples, has no real conception of international discourse, is subject to virtually no influence without Uganda or within. I've cut an awful lot out there, but I haven't just picked the most stereotypical phrases. There are plenty more. But clearly the idea is that Amin's violence comes from his over-Africanness. And what's good about him, what's positive, what keeps the country clean and disciplined and orderly, at least in Ewan's eyes, is his training in the British Army. This seems to, it's quite extraordinary to me, the idea that an army is fundamentally a cleaning service and has nothing to do with the violence and conflict. And I mean, having spent virtually all his adult life in the British Army, was quite clearly a product of it in rather more ways than his habit of whitewashing fences or paying people to whitewash fences. Another aspect that's quite amusing is this is the idea of Amin having dirty tricks and not being being a working class thug rather than a public schoolboy, and not fighting fairly. At the time Ewans was writing this, his boss was Dr. David Owen, who a few years back in his one of his books of memoirs wrote, "When I was Foreign Secretary and totally frustrated by the inability to stop Amin's massacres, I contemplated his assassination and discussed it with a similar senior diplomat liaising with MI6. But the culture against such an action had become deeply rooted within the security services in Britain." Which Owen seems to regret. So while Ewans was trumpeting about public school scruples, his boss was contemplating the assassination of an African head of state. I got more and more drawn towards, more interested in Amin's relationship with Britain and with the British states. In my earlier work on Amin, I pursued the obvious kind of approach for an anthropologist of trying to understand him through his cultural, ethno-historical background as a Kakwa and as a Nubi. But as I worked on the biography, I became more and more aware of the central importance of Amin's relationship with Britain, which I describe as by far the most important relationship in his life. I mean, the influence of British colonialism started back before he was born. In West Nile, British colonial rule only took over theoretically in 1914, but because of the First World War, in practice, they didn't really start trying to control people, to raise taxes, to use forced labor, to pay the taxes, to generally impose the colonial state on the area. It didn't really start happening till 1917, 18. And so the imposition of colonial rule in West Nile happens at pretty much the same moment that the influenza pandemic occurs. And in this kind of time of massive historical strains and pressures, there seems to have been a healing or resistance movement, or both, among the Kakwa people and to an extent the Lugbara people, the neighboring group as well, which was known as Yakan, and was had ritual elements and medicinal elements, and it was clearly a kind of anti-colonial resistance movement at the same time as being an anti-flu healing movement. One adept of that movement who became became nationally known across Uganda as a healer, was a young woman from mixed Kakwa and Lugbara ancestry named Aisha Chumaru Aate. And she married a former British soldier, Amin Dada Nyabira Tomaresu, who was had been born a Catholic and converted to Islam and joined the army like other people. He fought in Tanganyika in World War I for the British, and along with other veterans of that campaign was given land to settle in the West Nile district capital, Arua, which there's still an area in central Arua known as Tanganyika Village, which was where these people were settled by the British. He became a police officer in the colonial service and was stationed in various places around the country. And these were Idi Amin's parents. From birth, he was rooted in the British colonial world. He was probably born in 1928, though his date of birth is disputed. His name, Idi, apparently is a version of the Arabic Eid, because he was born on the festival of Eid al-Fitr in 1928. He often claimed to have fought for Britain in the Second World War, but officially, as far as records show, he only enlisted in 1946. So he was 18. And so from then onwards, he trained and fought as a soldier in the colonial army, the King's African Rifles. He was respected and liked by his superior officers and steadily promoted up the ranks despite lacking any formal education. At independence, he was one of only 2 commissioned officers in the army, which was handed over to Milton Obote as an independent Ugandan army. All the senior officers and right the way down to the most junior officers were Brits. In the complicated politics of post-independence Uganda, which I go into in some detail in the book, but I won't now. He stayed very much closely linked to the British. And not that he was entirely on the British side. He played all kinds of games with them, trading off British influence against Israeli influence for the supply of arms to the Ugandan army, for example. When he launched his coup against Milton Obote, and again I go into a lot more detail in the book, Amin had the full support of the British. His first international visit as head of state was to the UK, where he had lunch with the Queen, visited Scotland for a couple of days, and was briefed by British intelligence. They were trying to reassure him that Tanzania wasn't planning to invade Uganda, though of course later they did. He quickly fell out first with the Israelis and then with the British. The key thing in the latter really was his Amin's expulsion of the Uganda's Asian population, many of whom had British passports and came to the UK, of course. For the rest of his time in power, though, even after formal links with Britain had been broken off, Amin and the British Foreign Office authorities conducted a kind of strange on-off romance almost. One FCO report on him was titled "The Jilted Suitor," and they frequently talked about him in terms of having wanted to be British or be pro-British, but having been rejected by the British. And on both sides, it was a very kind of complicated relationship. Amin twice threatened to make surprise visits to Britain, and the government went into overdrive planning to keep him out. Virtually every ministry was involved in developing complex plans. Things like developing what military instructions would be given for when they could shoot at Amin's people, and right down to what would happen if he landed in Scotland with a different set of legal systems. He constantly peppered British politicians, and especially the Queen, with telegrams that, if you read them, they're exactly like trolling tweets. They're exactly the same kind of wind up that you get with social media trolls. When Margaret Thatcher was elected leader of the Tory party, he wrote congratulating her on her appearance, which he described as charming and fresh. He constantly expressed support for Irish, Scottish and Welsh national liberation movements in his term. And at the same time, the British constantly tried to woo him, partly to get compensation for the expropriated Asians. But also within, outside the rarefied world of the Foreign Office, this mocking of Amin in comic books, articles, TVs, newspapers. He became this kind of big cultural figure. In the book, I made two sort of surprising to me discoveries about this relationship. One is that, as far as I could discover, and there may be stuff missing, it doesn't look to me as though the British were behind his coup at all. In fact, the morning after the coup, the only way the British High Commission could find out what was happening was to send the defense attaché round to the Israeli embassy, where they knew what was happening. The second thing is that the expulsion of the Asians wasn't an idea Amin came up with from his anti-Asian racism, or that he was inspired by a dream. All these stories were told, including being suggested by Amin himself. But in fact, the policy of getting rid of the Asians had been developed by Milton Obote in the last years of his first rule in great detail. And they were well advanced and in long-standing negotiations with the British when the coup happened. And in fact, they were discussed on Amin's visit to Britain, which was a long while before he announced it. So much for the British context. I'll just wind up if I can here. One reviewer who got what I was trying to say concluded by writing that the surprise of my book was just how much through Amin we learn about ourselves and our own relationship with Africa. And I'll take that, but it's not the whole story. There's also the story of an incredible self-making, a boy growing up from the absolute bottom of the pyramid of Ugandan colonial society through the British Army to become the leader of the country. An extraordinary achievement in such a hierarchical context, but not as extraordinary as being a sadistic cannibal, a Nazi Satanist, an inhuman evil force, or any of the other implausible stories propagated by people with axes to grind. This caused a lot of problems for me in terms of getting the book published. Once it was written, I found myself in the difficult position of trying to sell publishers a book whose central argument was that its subject was less interesting than the reader thinks. The turning of Amin from a nasty dictator, which he was, into an evil, inhuman monster was the reason for the public interest in him. But I wanted to demonsterize him by looking at how the monster was created, to unpick what I call the demonography of Amin. And the original idea was to try to sift fact from fiction all the way through every event in Amin's life. But I found that it was just impossible to do. Truth and myth became completely inextricable. Primary and secondary sources constantly infected each other, and things that were written as fiction or popular journalism then got incorporated into human rights documents and into history as it has been written. So this kind of involved a lot of quoting things at length, a lot of assessment of historical methodology, a lot of discussion of these issues around Africanness and engagement in post-colonial theoretical debates. Weren't really of that much interest to Yale University Press, who very much wanted a straightforward biography, which stated in a sort of omniscient style all the truths I'd uncovered, and very much something written for a general non-academic audience. So there was a lot of toing and froing, and the book ended up slightly different and quite a lot shorter than the original version, which may well have improved it in many ways. Just to sort of very quickly wind up, my ideas around this British image of Amin as quintessentially African, the British idea of Africa, or a British idea of Africa. And it's quite clear in the quote I read out that there's a kind of class element here, the discussion of the public schoolboy. But in general, what I found is that the book has pretty exclusively been reviewed by right-wing media, newspapers and magazines that we would associate with the right, and liberal newspapers and magazines have not touched it with a barge pole. And this fits with various things I've observed around Amin, which is that liberals and the left tend to be embarrassed about him, whereas the right see him as proof of the racial inferiority of Africans. But the embarrassment of the left or of liberal society in even discussing or thinking about Amin, surely itself reinforces and is indeed based in the idea that his evil is associated with Africanness. Otherwise, why be embarrassed about it? So there is a kind of, on both sides, I think, a reinforcing of this stereotype. Okay, I've covered all kinds of things in the book that I haven't talked about today, but I think I should stop now. One thing I do want to say, perhaps in closing, is that it's not a social or political history of Uganda in the 1970s. It's not an oral history of the experiences of ordinary Ugandans. I'm not in any way denying or downplaying the horrible things that happened in Uganda under Amin. many of which he was more or less directly or indirectly responsible for. But that's not what the book is about. The book is about Idi Amin, the myth and the reality, how this extraordinary guy got turned into an international icon of evil. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I'll look forward to your questions, and I hope I can talk more widely in answering them.
Thank you, Mark, for that really fascinating and rich discussion. We're going to open up for questions, but before we do, I will